Think about the last time you had an argument with someone. Not a major fight, not some conflict you'd been processing for days, just something small. A sharp response that came out on its own, a tone you hadn't planned, a word you said before you finished thinking, and then, maybe a few minutes later, you wondered why you reacted that way. Or worse, you put together an explanation that sounded perfectly reasonable, almost as if you had decided to say it all along. What happened in that tiny gap between the trigger and the response is one of the most interesting and least examined corners of human behavior, because the feeling that we chose is almost always there, but that feeling doesn't always reflect what actually happened, and the distance between the two is bigger than most of us like to admit. Most of the time, the mind doesn't operate in reflective mode. It operates fast. It takes shortcuts, uses learned patterns, responds to signals in the environment before the conscious part even has a chance to step in. Not because we're irrational or careless, but because daily life demands speed. If we had to deliberately think through every small action from scratch, we simply couldn't function. The brain handles this by automating everything it can: walking, driving, saying hello, answering messages, buying the usual thing, reacting to someone's tone of voice. Those processes run on their own, quietly in the background, while conscious attention is busy somewhere else. The psychologist Daniel Kahneman described this as two systems operating side by side in the mind. One works fast, effortlessly, by association, always running. The other is slow, deliberate, mentally costly, and only kicks in when we genuinely need it. The first one handles most of daily life. The second one steps in when something is new, complicated, or when we make a real effort to think it through. The tension between them isn't constant or dramatic. It's quiet, and most of the time we don't even notice it's happening. The problem shows up when that fast mode takes over in situations that deserve more pause. And it does so without warning, without the feeling of choosing ever going away. There's a line of research that makes this pretty clear. In various decision-making studies, people are asked to explain why they chose what they chose: a brand, an answer, a preference. And the explanations come quickly, detailed, coherent. The problem is that in many cases the choice was shaped by factors the person had no awareness of: the order in which options appeared, background music, a prior association, their mood at that particular moment. The explanation they build afterward feels completely real to them, but it doesn't describe what actually drove the choice. It describes what the mind constructed to make sense of what had already happened. There's a name for this in psychology: confabulation. It's not lying. It's that the brain generates narratives of coherence without being asked. When we act before we think, something in us works to make it look like we thought before we acted. It's a function that protects the sense of continuity and control, but it can also hide the real levers of our own behavior from us. And this isn't some rare glitch or clinical condition, it's an everyday mechanism. It happens when we buy something on impulse and then come up with 3 solid reasons why it was actually a smart purchase. It happens when we take the familiar route, even though there's a better one, simply because the habit already kicked in. It happens when we react with irritation to something that wouldn't have bothered us on a different day, and then decide the irritation was completely justified. The mind is very good at building coherence backward. Habits are one of the most powerful engines behind this process. A habit isn't just a repeated behavior, it's a neural circuit that, when triggered by a specific cue, fires a response almost automatically. Over time, the cue and the response become so tightly linked that deliberation becomes unnecessary. That has real value. Habits free up cognitive resources, reduce effort, and allow us to carry out complex tasks without wearing ourselves out. But they can also keep us locked into patterns we no longer want, responding to contexts that changed a long time ago. A habit doesn't check whether it's still useful. What matters for it to activate is the cue, not whether the response still makes sense. That's why someone might keep eating at a certain time even when they're not hungry, because that time became the signal. Or they might keep avoiding a certain kind of conversation even though there's no real reason to anymore, because the avoidance pattern was set long ago. The habit doesn't ask whether you still want the same things, it just responds. Fatigue amplifies all of this. When we're exhausted, the ability to override an automatic response drops significantly. Self-control has a real energy cost, and when that resource runs low, impulses have more room to move. That's why so many decisions we later regret happen at the end of the day, during stretches of sustained stress, or after we've been making small decisions one after another for too long. It's not a character flaw, it's physiology. The environment also shapes behavior in ways we rarely notice. How objects are arranged in a room, which options appear first on a list, what the people around us are doing, the temperature, an image we saw 10 minutes ago. All of it influences what we choose without us being aware of the mechanism. Research on the architecture of choice shows again and again that small changes in context produce large shifts in behavior, even when people are convinced they're responding purely to their own preferences. This doesn't mean we're puppets of our environment or that willpower doesn't exist. It means willpower operates within conditions we don't always control or even know about, and that what we call a decision is often the result of a combination of habit, emotion, context, and available energy, with reflection arriving at the end, once everything is already in motion. There's also an emotional dimension here worth naming. Emotions aren't the noise that distorts rational decision-making. They're an active part of the process. Fear narrows the range of options the mind considers. Excitement expands it, sometimes more than is wise. Sadness tends to pull toward cautious choices. Anger compresses response time. There's no moment in which we decide without the emotional state of that instant being part of it, even if what we do afterward is build an explanation that doesn't mention it. What's interesting is that understanding this mechanism doesn't lead to paralysis. It does the opposite. It opens up a concrete possibility. If I know that certain behaviors fire automatically in response to certain cues, I can change the cues. If I know that exhaustion lowers my threshold for reaction, I can save important decisions for when I'm more alert. If I know the environment is quietly nudging me without my noticing, I can design environments that nudge me in the direction I actually want to go. The goal isn't to become perfectly rational, which isn't possible anyway, but to expand the margin of awareness around what moves us. Choosing well doesn't mean operating without impulses or habits. It means, in part, knowing them, knowing when they're running, recognizing when a response that feels like a decision was actually already underway before we asked ourselves anything. That doesn't shrink personal freedom. It makes it more honest, more grounded, less dependent on the illusion that we always know why we do what we do. There's something a little uncomfortable about accepting that a significant part of our behavior looks more like reaction than choice, because the sense of agency, of being the authors of our own actions, is central to how we understand ourselves. But that discomfort is worth sitting with, because the alternative, believing that every action comes from a clean, conscious deliberation, carries its own cost. The cost of not seeing the automatic patterns that take us places we didn't want to go, of mistaking justification for motive, of crediting reason for decisions that started somewhere else, much earlier, in a process we weren't watching. We're not pure reaction, but we're not pure will either. We're something more complex and more interesting than either of those versions. We're beings who sometimes choose with clarity, who sometimes simply continue a pattern that was already running, and who almost always build a story afterward that makes everything look more deliberate than it was. Recognizing that tension isn't giving up. It's a way of looking more honestly at which part of us is actually deciding and which part is simply responding. Understanding that doesn't make us smaller. If anything, it makes us more real.